So individuals vary, and not all of these variants will live or live long enough to have offspring. What affects this? Well, a number of things that the organism can experience. Some are called abiotic factors. So when we look at these flies, these vary. For example, these vary in their eye color, but certainly there are lots of potential variations in an organism. Um, some of the things that might cause some flies in a population to be more successful don't involve other living things. So it could be the amount of water. Some areas are very arid. It could be temperature. So you notice, there was a glacier in one of the backgrounds. The amount of rainfall over a year, the incidence of severe storms. So for example, with trees, flooding might affect a species that would otherwise occur in an area, or strong winds which would break branches. If we were to look at individual organisms, obviously plants rely on the nutrients in the soil. So if there's not nitrogen in the soil, then some plants which can't make their own nitrogen might be less likely to survive. The pH of the soil, the pH of the water. So corals may be less successful when the water becomes more acidic. The amount of oxygen which is dissolved in the water. So notice all of these things can affect an organism. So how successful an organism is, whether it's able to live or not, can be affected by temperature, by the amount of sunlight, by the amount of flooding, by the pH of the water, the nutrients in the soil, etc. And none of these involve other living things. So these are what are referred to as abiotic factors. So when you look at a population of living things, some may live and some may not live. Some may not live long enough to reproduce. And if you ask why that is, there can be abiotic factors which affect this reproductive success. But then there can also be biotic factors, because when organisms live in an area, they aren't by themselves. And so therefore, there are other organisms of their own species, organisms of different species. So they're competing, all right? They're competing with other members of their species for mates, their sexual selection. And so if females prefer the coloration of one bird, then that makes the other bird less likely to survive. Or to reproduce. There is the availability of food. So that great blue heron, which was feeding on that catfish, that bananaquit, which was pollinating the flowers, the owl, which is hunting for rodents, or the dragonfly hunting for insects. So the availability of prey is going to affect their reproductive success. Certainly, some organisms cause disease, as indicated here in this with those white blood cells. There are certainly viruses and ticks in the environment. And so these are biotic factors. So an organism might be able to survive, but it gets a disease and doesn't. And so in addition to abiotic factors, there are all of these biotic factors, members of one's own species, which you might be competing against with for food, for territories during mating season, but then also individuals of other species. There are prey items. There are predators that one is trying to avoid. There are disease organisms. So all of these are then biotic factors, which can have an effect on whether an animal lives and whether it is able to pass down its genes to the next generation. So we speak of natural selection in that not all individuals live long enough to reproduce. The ones that do seem to be adapted to a specific environment. That environment seems to select for certain traits. In certain situations, it is an advantage to be camouflaged. In certain populations, there is an advantage in having the plumage that the opposite gender finds attractive. In certain environments, it is adaptive to be able to climb trees to prey on eggs or swim in water because of the abundance of fish. And so those variants which survive are those which are that offer an adaptation, which offer an advantage in this environment. Now, many of these adaptations aren't absolute. So, a more yellowish fly would be at a disadvantage if, in an environment where, the vegetation was darker. A darker fly would be at a disadvantage if the background was lighter. And so what is an adaptation? What trait is adaptive varies. Having a large brain helps some animals, all right, but brains are pretty expensive. And so many animals have reduced the size of their brains, such as intestinal parasites. If you don't need a big brain, then having a big brain is an nutrient expense that one doesn't need. And so therefore, as populations change over time, as the next generation has a different set of variations as the previous generation, very often there is some sort of natural selection where it is those abiotic and biotic factors in the environment which are determining what is adaptive in this environment versus what isn't. Let's just kind of go through two examples which sum up a lot of these thoughts, both here and then from the previous video on the process of evolution. So let's just take giraffes. Obviously, having a long neck, if you're a giraffe, helps with reaching leaves and trees. The earliest giraffes didn't really have lengthened necks. There were a lot of giraffes which had shorter necks than the ones which exist today. And today there is still the okapi, which is a wild giraffe which has a shorter neck. So why do modern giraffes have long necks? Well, once again, evolution provides a natural mechanism for this. All right, one doesn't have to appeal that, long-necked giraffes suddenly appeared going back to the beginning of time, and so that it was a kind of a supernatural event which gave the long necks. But rather, longer necks could have developed in this way. So let's follow the scenario where we have all of these giraffes. Notice that there's variation in the population. Variation is key, whether it be through mutation or through sexual selection. Some of these giraffes have longer necks than others. And if the vegetation is changing, maybe through drought or a new species of plants or whatever, so that the only really abundant leaves are higher up, then it is an advantage to have a longer neck. The lighter ones are more likely to live and more likely to reproduce. And so if here we have two variations, if this one can find food and this one can't, this one is more likely to pass down its genes to the offspring. It's more likely to have more offspring. And so if we start with a population where that was rare, all right, so this yellowish form that has the longer neck, that's a rarity. All right, the majority of the population looks like this. But nevertheless, because this one has an advantage, then it's going to have more offspring. And then in future generations, there will be more of those. Instead of being, say, 10% of the population, now we're going to have them become 20 or 30%. Now notice, as the population is changing, it's not that all individuals have suddenly gotten longer necks. What is happening is the frequency of these long-necked forms is increasing. So let me just address two misconceptions here. So one, it's not as if the trees got taller and then the giraffes realized, oh, if I'm going to survive, I have to mutate. No, these variations were already there. Our populations vary. That's just something that populations do through mutation and sexual selection. So the variation to have a longer neck that didn't arise after the change in the trees, that was already there. And then it was just dumb luck that these individuals had a trait which helped them live longer and have more offspring. And then just dumb luck that in this environment, these didn't. Now, having a shorter neck might be an advantage in different environments. If vegetation slows down, because obviously having a really long neck might have some disadvantages. But in this environment, having a long neck was a benefit. And so then the population changed over time. The next generation had more giraffes with longer necks. The generation after that had more still. The generation after that had more still. Once again, not all of the individuals suddenly got longer necks. It was that the frequency of the long neck variant went up from 10%, to 20%, to 30%, et cetera. Now, because variation keeps on occurring, look at these white individuals. Here's a new mutation where they have longer necks still. And then the population, this could all happen again. So these longer necks forms could then increase if they're more likely to find food and live long enough to reproduce. The frequency there could increase from, say, 10% to 20% to 30%. And eventually, perhaps all of the giraffes now have long necks because the shorter neck forms weren't able to find food. There you would see a population change over time through natural mechanisms. So this is what evolution holds, that through these natural mechanisms, there can be a change over time, and perhaps now the origin of a new species of longer-necked giraffe. Looking at bacteria, once again, if this is normal bacteria, and these are mutant bacteria here in pink, in this population, it just happens that there's a mutation, a variant. This happens. Mutations happen all the time. This one just happens to be dumb luck to be resistant to an antibiotic. What advantage is that? Well, if the antibiotic isn't in the environment, being resistant to something that isn't there offers zero adaptive value. So that doesn't have to be a good mutation. Just like having a longer neck in a giraffe, if there's plenty of leaves that one can get on low branches, having a longer neck doesn't have to be an advantage. But if the antibiotic is then in the environment, then the yellow ones are more likely to die. The pink ones are more likely to survive. And so the variation was already there. And in a certain environment, that variation may now undergo natural selection, where it has an adaptive value, making the organisms more likely to survive in this case, or more likely to reproduce or mate in other examples. And so now the frequency of these pink mutant forms is going up. All right, so notice not all of these bacteria changed. All right, so once you apply an antibiotic, it's not like they all mutate and become antibiotic resistant. Instead, what is happening is because the variations which were already resistant now are more likely to survive, over time, the frequency of that trait is going up. Natural selection is favoring this trait, which in this environment is an adaptation that helps these bacteria survive. Now, ultimately, all of the yellow ones may die. And so thus we may see that, all members of the population now are resistant to this antibiotic. At some point, the variations may get to the point where we call it a new species. So here's a new species, which is now significantly different from the ancestral species. Once again, this is a change over time through natural mechanisms. So evolution can occur in many ways, but here's just the general model. So one, there was a great number of potential offspring. There was more bacteria than could potentially survive. There were more giraffes than could potentially survive. And not all individuals did survive. So the next generation didn't have representations of all of the previous generation, just a select few. But because they varied, and because the variations then affected which individuals could survive long enough to reproduce, the longer-necked giraffes were more likely to live and reproduce. The antibiotic-resistant bacteria were more likely to survive and reproduce. That their genes were more likely to be passed down to the next generation, and thus the population changed over time. Okay. Now, this natural selection, all right, this, molding of, the next generations of organisms based on the pressures which are put on them, this can take many forms. And so, in general, all right, biologists, often speak of 3 different types of natural selection. So let's just pick, say, dogs, for example. In dogs, there are big ones, there are large breeds, there are small breeds, there are medium-sized breeds. Let's say that in a certain environment, it's easy for the medium-sized breeds to survive, to find food or whatever, but not as easy for the big or the small breeds. So the form which has the greatest advantage is the average size breed. Well, in this scenario, then the average size of dogs would tend to stay the same, because there's not an ever increasing number of large dogs or an ever increasing number of small dogs. Instead, the average size dogs, and so natural selection in this case would tend to stabilize the population. So the trait of, in size, which is already there, natural selection would tend to maintain it at its current average. That's what is referred to as stabilizing selection. However, if it was in a different environment, if it was very difficult for small dogs to find food, kind of difficult for medium-sized dogs to find food, but the large-sized dogs were able to, hunt deer or something that other sized dogs were having difficulty with, then the larger-sized dogs would then be the ones which were most likely to reproduce, the small dogs the least likely. And so then as more and more large dog genes were present in future generations, then one would experience a directional change. So this would be directional selection. The average size of dogs would tend to increase. The opposite could be true if small dogs were the ones who had the easiest time finding food. In that scenario, now there would be directional selection in that the smallest dogs are the most successful and becoming more and more common in future populations. So directional selection will nudge the population in one direction or the other. In disruptive selection, perhaps the small dogs can find food and the large dogs can find food, but the medium-sized dogs couldn't. And so here, the 2 extreme phenotypes would be favored, and it would be the intermediates, which would then be selected against. Okay, and so natural selection can work in different ways. Obviously, this is an overview of the videos I have in this playlist, and so then you could, all of these videos then go through this in greater detail. I then also have videos which then simulate some populations of finches. All right, so I'm sorry, let me see. Stabilizing selection. So let's imagine that the width of a finch's bill determines which seeds it is best able to eat. So maybe narrow bills are better able at, in this one area, finding softer seeds, and the thicker bills better at finding at being able to crush the thicker seeds. And as we go to finches, clearly this varies, and Charles Darwin studied finches on the Galapagos Islands. And so let's just say that there is variation, that here is the original thickness of the bill. And, if we wanted, because I have an exercise on this for my students, that you could actually then measure, the thickness of the bill in millimeters. So here it's going to be depicted, with colors, right? But we could then, say, oh, so this one is, 7 millimeters. This bill is 6 millimeters. It's thinner. We could have a thick bill, et cetera, which is thicker. In this environment, the plants which are making average seeds, they are doing the most, all right? So that there are thick seed plants and soft seed plants, but it's these average size seeds which are doing best. And so therefore, the finches, which the average bills, they are the ones who are best able, to make use of the most common food in the area. So it was the average size bills which would then have the most, the greatest offspring. And so if you were to look at the finch population, if this middle group was the one that was most able to find food, then the next generation would probably repeat that the majority of finches would have the average size bill. And this population would tend to keep this, this distribution of traits. So this is what we would see, say, if stabilizing selection was operating. So a graph like this, could represent, once again, stabilizing selection. However, one could imagine scenarios where the environment changes, as environments often do. And so that maybe the area becomes drier. And now the soft seeds, they become harder to find. Those seeds become less and less common. So here, notice that the soft seeds are becoming less common, the harder seeds more common. So in this scenario, now it would be the finches with the thick bills that would be most likely to find food. They would be the ones most likely to pass down their genes to the next generation. Now, once again, let me just repeat those 2 points that I already made. First, it wasn't as if the plants changed and then the finches decided to mutate. These variations were already there. Variations occur randomly. And then it's not as if all of these finches then decide, let's get thick bills. No, what happens is instead the frequency of thick bills could gradually change. So if you measure that in a population, how many finches have thick bills, this could then change over time. Now, once again, there's still variation in the population, but the variation is changing over time based on which organisms are most likely to find food to survive and to reproduce. We could also imagine a case of directional selection where the finches with the thinner beaks preying on the softer seeds are the ones which are most successful. So these are examples of directional selection. And notice that one of the extremes in the population's distribution is favor. That's, a distribution which, would lead us to believe that perhaps directional selection is acting there. Now, finally, let's imagine a scenario of disruptive selection. So while some species are generalists, all right, so they want to be able to feed on all kinds of seeds, soft, average, and thick. Sometimes there's an advantage in specializing, especially if you live in an environment where something is common. So let's imagine, say, there's two halves of an island. On one half of the island, the soft seeds are dominant and most common. On the other half of the island, then the thicker seeds are dominant. Well, now what one could see on the island is on one half, let's say the thicker, billed finches have the advantage. On the other half of the island, the thinner billed finches are having the advantage. And so thus, on the island as a whole, we're seeing what's called disruptive selection. All right, so the ones in the middle, they are the least able, to thrive on this island. And this might ultimately give rise to two different species. So one ancestral species where the most common form was this average size bill could then give rise to two separate species, one species with a thicker bill, one with a thinner bill. And so natural selection favors organisms which have an adaptation to the environment. But natural selection can act in different ways. Stabilizing selection, can favor the average condition which the population already has. Directional selection can favor one of the extremes in the population distribution. And then disruptive selection can actually favor both extremes, and the average population could then actually be at a disadvantage. Before the idea of evolution became, a fundamental component of biology, the average ideas was that populations really don't change over time. That if you went to when life began, and if you were to go forward in the future to when life ends, gray squirrels would look about the same. Woodpeckers would look about the same. Great blue herons would look about the same. White oaks would look about the same. That populations don't change over time. Now, with an evolutionary understanding, we realize, well, that's not true, that populations will change over time. We don't expect gray squirrels to look just like they do today 1,000 years from now. We don't expect white oaks to look different, to look exactly the same 1,000 years from now. So like, for example, in these flies, we expect that over time, fly populations will change because the environment is changing. The temperature changes, rainfalls change, they adapt to new areas, there's new parasites, new predators. So there are abiotic and biotic factors which change. We expect these fly populations to change over time as well. All right. Now, so they will change, but getting back to the idea of species, when do we call this a different species? So are they considered different species? No, they seem to be, identical, or they seem to be members of one single population, one single species. These are a little bit different though. Are they a different species? Maybe not. Maybe we call them subspecies. What about these? I don't know. Maybe we do call them different species, but they're still similar enough that they can interbreed sometimes. And then maybe, we get to something like this, and then we have now species which are so different that they no longer interbreed, that we say, yes, they are 100% two different species of flies. So first, when we talk about the origin of species, it's important to recognize that this is a process. All right, so it's not as if here's a new species, suddenly appearing. That we can go through gradual changes where from a population we just have two variants, and then these variants then change and become subspecies. And then we might recognize them as potentially different species, but they can still interbreed to some degree. And then maybe at some point they are so distinct that they can no longer interbreed. And so speciation, so if populations are changing over time, that this can then gradually produce new species. So by the end, we would clearly say, oh, clearly those are two different, species, however. But once again, it was the result of a gradual process. Now, we could ask, because one of the definitions of species is that individuals can then reproduce together. All right, so a species can be defined as those populations which are capable of reproducing together under natural conditions. We could ask, well, do these fish form one species? Now, this is a very complex question, and some biologists only study speciation. But let me just very simply try to depict it here with chromosomes, instead of, say, genetic sequences or whatever. So if we look at chromosomes, these two fish, they have comparable chromosomes. So sure, they could mate, and then their offspring would potentially be, quite successful. However, if populations change to the point, remember that populations change over time, and these mutations accumulate. There are changes in genetic sequences. There can be changes here. Let me just represent it this way because it's more visual, in chromosomes. So chromosomes can add sections, lose sections, sections can get switched, chromosomes can smush together, chromosomes can split, so that over time, as these two populations changed, that maybe they now differ in their chromosomes. And if we ask the question, should they mate? Well, after a certain point, the genetic differences are such that if these organisms tried to reproduce together, their offspring wouldn't do well. So maybe if they did try to mate, well, maybe the sperm wouldn't fertilize the eggs. Maybe the eggs would be fertilized, but then they would die. Or maybe the majority would die and only some would survive. Maybe the ones that survived would be less healthy, less fit in the environment. Maybe their offspring would survive, but be infertile, all right, because of the chromosome abnormalities that a large number of the sperm or ova that their offspring produce would be non-functional. In that scenario, should these fish mate? Then the answer is no. They shouldn't mate to a different population because their offspring are now less likely to be successful. They're more likely to now lose their reproductive investment because their offspring simply aren't doing well. And so as populations change over time, for a while, they can interbreed and they're simply variations of the same population, of the same species. But then their differences can accumulate to the point where now there is a disadvantage if they try to mate with the other population. The genetic differences have accumulated to the point where the offspring would then be at a disadvantage. All right. If this individual wanted to pass on as many genes as it could to the next generation, it shouldn't try to reproduce with a member of a population where the offspring are less likely to survive or possibly would be fertile. And so after a certain degree of genetic difference has arisen between two populations in nature, then reproducing between them then becomes less advantageous. The offspring are less likely to survive. Now, we see that if these two populations were isolated from each other, that then favors this accumulation of genetic differences. So you could have, that was an African hornbill. Here we have, South American toucans. Very often you find species living in one part of the world. All right, so why are there different cats in South America than in Africa? Why are there different, birds in North America than South America? Why is there a different animal on this island than other islands? Well, once again, so geography can play a role in this. And so if a population spreads so that they're on different continents, on an island, on different sides of a mountain range, then as things evolve, as populations change over time, you could now have genetic differences on one side of the mountain range compared to the other, genetic differences on the island compared to the mainland, genetic differences on one side of the big river as the other, on one continent versus the other. And so therefore then, geography helps to establish this, give the opportunity for variations to accumulate. Okay. Once we have gotten to that point, all right, so once separate populations have been isolated from each other, genetic differences have accumulated, and now if they try to mate together, the offspring are less likely to thrive than if each individual mated with members of its own population. Now, it then is an advantage if these individuals are choosier, if they then find a way of distinguishing between which populations could I, reproduce with and have healthy offspring versus which ones I couldn't. Now, this seems a little odd for humans. There's only one human species. So if, you're at a party, you pick a partner and, your partner looks human, well, then they are. And so you don't have to worry about, are there genetic differences which would affect the health of my offspring? But if you think of, say, ducks, coming back from migration in spring, it's mating season, but there could actually be a dozen different species of duck on the same lake. So one species is potentially not advantaged by mating with these other species because they would waste their reproductive energy. Like the females would produce eggs which wouldn't hatch or young that wouldn't thrive. And that then is reproductive energy lost. And so then at a certain point, then these individuals need to be able to distinguish between those populations which are kind of its group with whom it should reproduce versus populations that are the other group that might be so different that reproduction with that group would not be an advantage. And this is why when you say look at warblers, that we see so many color variations. This is a signal to all members who's in what group. So the females of one group say, well, this is the male, say, of my group as opposed to this male. So their coloration then helps then reinforce this isolation. So females may now prefer the coloration of one group because the genetic similarities with this male would ensure healthy offspring, while males that look different would be potentially less likely to thrive. And then there are certainly other ways as well, as I just go through some of the examples here. So once populations have begun to get to the point where they're potentially different species, even if they can hybridize a little still, because many species can still hybridize at least at some point, then they try to develop signals so that this female knows that that's a male of her group. This female knows that that's a male of her group. This female knows that that's a male of her group. So coloration can play a role. So too can courtship song. All right, and so whether it be birds making songs, whether it be frogs that make songs, or insects like crickets and katydids and the like, then these are signals. So female frogs can be listening and know that this is a male of group 1 versus this is a male of group 2. Lightning bugs can use flashes of light. Mammals often use pheromones. All right, so when dogs sniff each other, when many mammals smell each other, they're getting an olfactory signal, which is an advantage in mammals because lots of mammals are nocturnal, and then coloration differences don't have the same role. Okay, and so then one of the things that reinforces then this isolation to promote the formation of new species is that individuals are looking for some of these cues, whether these be visual cues or olfactory cues or auditory cues, to recognize I'm going to reproduce with members of this group because members of other groups might be so genetically distinct that the offspring would not thrive. So what I've described here is something that we take, for granted today. We know that new species have evolved. I mean, some of them have actually evolved in human history. It is easily documentable that species have evolved, and some species are so similar to each other that they can actually interbreed. So clearly, they are related. What Charles Darwin proposed was a natural set of mechanisms where, starting off with, say, one ancestral population, that the population could change over time. And included in this change would be that then, populations, say in different areas, different islands or whatever, might have changed relative to each other to the point where they don't reproduce together anymore. And from one ancestral population, you now have two different species. Charles Darwin's book was published, The Origin of Species, and that was his point, to then explain how natural mechanisms could give rise to much of the variation, many of the new traits which we see in the world today, and then also the species which we see in the natural world today.